Welcome everyone. Myself, Professor Praveen Kumar Pathak. I am working at the Center for Study of Regional Development at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. Today we are going to discuss an important issue called global population change, related perspectives and challenges. Now, global population change has a very characterized history, pattern and implications. So in today's lecture, I will try to underline the contrasting journey of the global population change between so-called developed world and the developing world. We would also attempt to understand set of characteristics of society when the process of global population change was initiated, and also when the population underwent the process of demographic change, then at the penultimate stage, what were the characteristics of the society. So the idea is basically to draw a clear-cut understanding of how the process of global population change is related with the development scenario of the respective regions or countries. So as we know that since the arrival of human being on this planet, the increase in the global population numbers for a large part of human history was fairly small or insignificant. Part of the reason of why that was the case is directly related with the structure and nature of then society. So what is those characteristics that led to, which we also call as pre-transitional societies? So in cases where any population is in a situation of pre-transitional state, there are number of factors, causal factors play very important role. Why we have relatively higher death rates and therefore relatively higher birth rates. And the idea of what is high birth and death is also dependent upon the given area. So usually we say that the crude death rate and the crude birth rate are in the zone of 40 plus. So CBR of more than 40 children per thousand population, and CDR, crude death rate, of also around 40 to 45 deaths per thousand population. So because the nature of life in a traditional society is completely determined by factor of chance, there is a huge issue of insecurities, multiple insecurities. Human population largely depends on agriculture, where food is the biggest challenge for survival. And so therefore, we also have this problem of burden of diseases, predominantly communicable and infectious diseases. So therefore what happens is large number of births which takes place are unfortunately not able to survive. And so therefore, in order to compensate for higher mortality, particularly infant and child mortality, population has to compensate through higher birth rates. So this is a response of society for a given mortality scenario. And then what happens? Along with these issues of food insecurity, poor health circumstances, the economic activity are by and large dependent upon agricultural allied activity. More than 80 to 90% of the population is directly involved in some form of primary activity. So basically, the population is dependent on agriculture allied sector. Another important characteristics of such pre-transitional or agrarian or traditional society is that there is a very clear-cut gender divide or gender inequalities, if I may call that. And so therefore what happens, majority of women have very limited opportunity of investing their time into activity beyond progeny or reproductive career because of higher death rate, and also because the development status of traditional society is very relatively low. So women do not have opportunity to access and go for education or employment opportunities. Large proportion of their time goes into bearing and rearing of children. And plus, most of these society also do not have a democratic setup. So largely these are societies which are basically suffer from poor quality of governance. So these are some of the characteristics which are associated with traditional societies that are related with high equilibrium of birth rates and death rates. And so therefore the net increase in the number of human population remains to be rather small. Now how this process of population change actually happens? So as the nature of economy in any region or country or society undergoes changes. So let's take an example. For example, in the context of Western European countries, after the era of Renaissance, Reformation, Enlightenment, number of revolutions followed in French, American, all of this led to advancement of science, logical thinking, reasoning, and gradually people started to understand that in order to secure life, in order to live a life which is more consistent, more secure, the only way is advancement in science and technology. And so therefore gradually traditional society, when understood the importance of modern science and technology, started to change the structure of their economy, gradually shifting from largely agricultural allied activities, predominantly living in rural areas, towards a mechanized forms of production. Now what happens in traditional societies, as the mode of production is agrarian, large families are the norm. The reason being, most of the members of the family find some sort of opportunities for production in the household's lands. However, as the nature of economy changes towards greater mechanization, what happens is that gradually there is increase in production per capita. There is greater production, means improvement in per capita income in the society. So if you take an example of the Western European countries around 17th or 18th century during Industrial Revolution, what happened was the fact that due to increased production, the average standard of living in the population started to improve. This improvement in the economic and standard of living of the general public meant that now people have greater control on their life circumstances thanks to science and technology. This also meant that now people can produce more agricultural surplus, food supply improved, per capita availability of food improved, access improved, nutritional quality improved. So this all meant that there was a drastic drop in the infant and child death rates. which eventually led to the improvement in the life expectancies at birth. So with improvement in food supply, improvement in the standard of living, and also this led to gradual or rapid actually decline in mortality levels, because number of infectious and communicable diseases, for example cholera, diarrhea, number of people, particularly infant kids, would not survive because of fever, cholera, diarrhea, etc. So with advancement in the economic standard of living of people, greater control on life, and better medical facilities, this helped to control the burden of diseases in the Western countries, and the rapid impact was realized in terms of drop in the infant and child death rates. So if you look at the global population change, with the first circumstance is always mortality decline in most of the cases. So when mortality starts declining, it takes some time, roughly about one generation, 30 to 35 years, for others in the society who are living in different part of the country or find themselves in different economic class, social class, different backgrounds. It takes time for them to realize gradually that the burden of disease in the society is actually coming down. And so accordingly, when this mortality declines on a consistent basis, the impact is that suddenly, if you look at the age pyramid of the population, there is an increase in the share of infant and child population. So if you remember, when mortality is high, number of children who are born of course are high, but many of them are not surviving. With mortality coming down, you have increased number of infant and child who are now surviving. So what is happening at the family level? In number of families, if suppose family is having 6 to 7 children on an average, and majority of them are now surviving, which was not the case several years ago, so it means that there is a direct impact on per capita or per children availability of resources. Now the family's resource budget is severely stressed out, whether it is food, whether it is education, whether it is health, whether it is entertainment, all the cost increases, and more importantly the cost of time that the parents and the kids in the family will have to invest in order to take care of each and every kids is far more higher in case when the mortality is declined and fertility remains high. So with their increased survival rates of infant and child, there is a rapid stress on the household budget to secure the health and well-being of children. And when this gradually happens in most of the household of society or any country, then again there is a call for demographic response from the society. So what happens? Society responds to this important demographic change through regulating fertility. In traditional society, mostly the fertility is natural fertility, wherein there is no artificial means that is practiced to space or regulate births. But as modernization, industrialization and urbanization takes place, there is a shift in the fertility regulations as well. So as we see that mortality is declining, fertility is high and stable, there is a transitory period wherein the population number of any society increases at a very fast rate. In many literature, this is also referred to as stage of population explosion. However, roughly about 40 to 45 years, when society responds through fertility regulations, the number of children per family gradually then starts to come down. And this means that now people produce relatively lower number of children as compared to what they were doing generation or couple of generations ago. Now, if we would want to understand when this process of global population change actually completes, then how the nature of society is different from a stage where it actually started. So among the host factors which are related, some of the simplistic characteristic which we may underline is this: that typically when any country or society achieves the lower equilibrium of low birth and low death rate, basically this population change is all about the stretched disequilibrium that we find between initial stage of high equilibrium of birth and death rate and the final stage of low equilibrium of birth and death rate. So the in between intermediate phase is the phase of unequilibrium or disequilibrium, which responds to changing modern development factors. So when this process is complete, we observe that society typically have very low birth rates. For example, today if you see any of the Western countries or even in many low and middle income countries like India, most of these countries have birth rates below replacement level fertility, which basically means that each couple is being replaced by another couple. Mortality levels are also very low. So which means that all the births, most of these births which takes place today in these countries, on an average is expected to survive for 85 years and above. Plus, most of these societies are highly urbanized. Majority of the population in such countries are living in major cities and towns. We also follow that most of these societies are run through science, technology, industries and business, wherein there is a greater scope for women to contribute. So the major difference is that now here, because due to better opportunities of education, employment, livelihood, women are able to contribute more time into economically productive activities due to lower birth rates, as compared to societies which are traditional, where because of the huge burden of higher fertility, women often would not get opportunities of going to schools, colleges or universities, or even after attaining education look for opportunities of gainful employment. So along with this, another important distinction in the countries where they have almost completed their population transition is the fact that most of these countries have emerged as a very strong democratic nations, wherein governance is delivering results for the common public. So by and large, and of course the nature of society, nature of economy is very different, very diversified economic functions. People are working in industries, people are working in services, more men are working in non-agricultural allied activities, because thanks to lower birth rates. So therefore, if you compare these set of characteristics, it would automatically tell us that there are certain conditions that shape the demographic processes in any society or population. It's not something which is completely running on its own. It is actually responding to the prevailing economic, social and cultural situation of any region or state or society. And so therefore the relationship is just not unidirectional. Actually this relationship is bidirectional. To begin with, demographic processes, whether they are birth, death or migration, respond to the prevailing economic, social and cultural situation. And in due course of time, the population processes operate, and gradually changing population composition determines the levers of development process as well. So I would like to share with you a couple of examples. Let's take case of Sweden, and when it entered into the process of demographic change in middle of 18th century. Now, if you look at this graph, it documents the demographic journey. I'm just taking a case of Sweden because as a representative case of the Western countries, who of course underwent demographic transition 200 years ago, since the developing nations actually experienced. Now if you see, this curve is a very interesting curve. Basically, if you look at the top line is the birth rate, the lower line is the death rate, and then the third one, the lowest one, is the natural increase. So you see that in the beginning, the gap between birth and death rate is relatively smaller, and therefore if you look at the lowest line, the the net increase in the population is very, very small during middle 18th century. And as industrial revolution happened in Europe around 1820s and something, so gradually we see that there is a rapid drop in the death rate of the population. The birth rate remains high and stagnated, and then you have a phase where there is a rapid increase in the population in Sweden. And this continued for roughly 30 to 40 years, after which we see that birth rate also starts to falling down, coming much closer to the, of course, declining death rates. And then finally, birth and death rates achieve lower equilibrium level, and the population increase started to basically become stagnated or stabilize. So if you compare, this entire process roughly unfolded in about 200 years. So this is what is this journey of demographic change in the Western society, wherein demographic changes, of course, were recorded for the first time, took relatively longer period of time. This was very gradual, and so therefore demographic changes in the Western context are very different if we were to compare it from the context of the developing countries.